Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm joined here by Sarah Carmichael from Bloomberg's Opinion Desk. Sarah, thank you for making the time. Just want to start by asking how you're holding up and how you're doing.
Thank you for asking. I am doing well. I feel very lucky to be isolating with a husband who loves to cook. So I feel very fortunate.
That
How
is
are
great to
you?
hear. I'm good. I'm good. It's nice for both of us that we are out of the city and we have some outdoor space. So we are very lucky to have that. I want to introduce ourselves to the audience real quick. My name is Madison Mills. I'm a reporter with Bloomberg, joined here by Sarah Carmichael, who recently wrote about working from home and what our future of remote work could look like. For folks watching, please comment with any questions you have for Sarah, and I will ask as many as I can. I want to start off by just doing an overview of this piece you just wrote. Can you talk our audience through some of your thoughts on working from home more permanently?
Yeah, so recently a number of companies, many of them in the tech industry, have decided to just say that people can work from home indefinitely or permanently or until the end of the year. There's been some kind of long-term plan made. And this is an interesting development to me in part because I think one thing it gives employees is a sense of certainty, which we have had so little of during this time. It's kind of a way of saying, we can craft a new normal together. We're not just at the mercy of events. And it's also a way of giving people perhaps more flexibility and for a lot of people, something they may have wanted for a long time. So I see it as a very positive development overall, although it's not without its challenges, which I'm sure we'll get to.
Right, that's such a great point, Sarah. We see over and over that people would much prefer to work from home, particularly in these open offices that are very popular right now. I'm wondering why more companies aren't committing to that full pledge to have people work remotely.
It's a really big change. I mean, there is a real culture of FaceTime, and I think a lot of bosses have been very anxious about work from home arrangements. I think that one thing that this crisis has forced people to confront is that people can work from home and be productive at home. So, some of the early data we're seeing suggests that people are actually putting in more hours at home, which holds true with data that we had collected on people who work remotely before the pandemic. So I think bosses who are maybe skeptical are coming around. And that's another reason why I think you see people gravitating towards this as not just a short term sort of crisis solution, but as a potentially long term solution.
Right. And you mentioned that it's nice to just have that kind of certainty right now when so much is up in the air. Do you think that more companies will at least commit to a certain month that people might expect to return to work? Or what do you see the upcoming trends of these announcements looking like?
I sort of see three distinct approaches. One
Okay.
is the work from home indefinitely. This is just what we're doing now. This is a permanent thing. Then there's on the other extreme, there's this kind of, you know, come back as soon as possible. We're going to revisit this every 2 weeks kind of rolling approach. And then there's something in between where some companies are basically taking it quarter by quarter and saying, okay, it's almost June. We're probably going to be doing this till September. And that's a kind of way to kind of balance both approaches because I think for some bosses and some jobs, working remotely is really not possible. And it's really about the kind of work you do. So if you are in the knowledge transfer business and you're on a laptop all day, then probably working from home is going fine. But if you're in a different industry where face-to-face contact is more important, then those are the companies that are going to want to find a way to get back sooner.
Absolutely. And can you talk us through some of those industries that might just not be able to work from home and what their options might look like?
Yeah, so I think a lot of them are the service jobs, right? I mean, you cannot give someone a haircut remotely. You cannot clean someone's teeth remotely. So there are things that are at all kinds of different jobs that are going to require some kind of in-person contact. The jobs where you can work from home tend to be information based, technology based. Maybe you're a consultant who mostly does research. And even if you were used to traveling 4 days a week before, maybe you've now realized that, in fact, you don't need to be doing that. So I think this is forcing us to confront a lot of hard truths and assumptions we've had for a long time about the value of FaceTime and about whether you really need to be present in person to do the work or not.
Right, right. And you've talked a lot about the value of FaceTime. I think something that people are questioning right now is job growth, right? The moment of the pandemic, it feels like people are okay with delaying discussions about salary raises or job growth or things like that. But if we're working from home for years to come, people are going to want to have those conversations, right? So when do you think that moment will shift where people start to feel comfortable talking about their career trajectory from home?
Right. I think that's a really great question. And so I have a couple different takes on this. The really optimistic take is that this will be a great way to cut out a lot of the kind of politicking and image conscious maneuvering in the office, where you get ahead not by producing a superior work product, but by schmoozing with the right people and, coming in early and staying late and just appearing to always be working, which I don't think is healthy and which doesn't usually correlate with actual performance outcomes. So in a sense, if this shifts us towards a way of recognizing merit that is really based more on what someone produces and not how they seem, then I think it could have a really positive outcome for people who do great work, but who maybe aren't the most vocal in meetings or who don't hang around the water cooler looking to kiss up to the boss, right? So that's the optimistic take. The pessimistic take is that there are going to be new kinds of schmoozing and politicking that come out of this. Maybe you think, okay, every Tuesday I randomly send an email to my boss telling him or her what I worked on this week, because my work is just not as visible if I'm not in the office. So there are going to need to be new ways that we promote our work. But I do think, especially in companies that are healthy, raises and promotions are still definitely possible.
And did I hear you correctly there that there's not necessarily a correlation to your output and the hours you spend at the office? Can you talk about that a bit more?
Yeah, this is one of those research findings that has been borne out again and again and again, and which I love, because basically it means that most managers, right, default to judging what's easy to observe, which is how quickly someone replies to an email or how often they see them in the office. Do they see them walking quickly through the office with a sense of purpose? But actually, if you look at performance reviews, there is not really, managers can't really tell who's working long hours and who's only pretending to work long hours. So there are some people who pretend to work long hours through sort of moves and chicanery, but who are not actually sort of putting in as much time as they seem to be. So managers have a really hard time distinguishing that, which to me suggests that, in fact, superior performance is not the same thing as working all the time. And we know from cognitive studies that if you work all the time, your performance actually declines.
Well, that is a study that I can get behind. So thank you for sharing that. I want to go to some audience questions that we got in overnight here. We have one question from a user who asked, if I want to work from home permanently, should I expect a pay cut? And I think this is something we also want to talk about with Facebook's announcement from last week, but I'm wondering if you can just respond to that question.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the company and the industry. I think, ideally, in a perfect world, companies are paying people for the value of the work they provide. And that shouldn't change that much if you are working from home. And for some people, it might go up. In fact, you might provide more value if you are able to concentrate better and aren't interrupted all the time by colleagues. So I think that it's going to really depend on conversations with individual managers and bosses. Now, Facebook, very interestingly, said basically people who take advantage of the new work from home policy to move out of the very expensive California neighborhood where Facebook is located will get a pay cut. And I have to say, on the one hand, I guess good for Facebook for being transparent about that. On the other hand, it's a very sort of strange announcement in that it was sort of accompanied by this comment that anyone who tries to hide where they're working to avoid a pay cut will be severely punished, which is like, okay, so you're setting up from the beginning that you don't really trust your employees, which is very strange in a remote work environment, especially where trust is really important. And then also a pay cut is, human beings have an instinctive reaction to having things taken away from them. We don't like it. We might be willing to forego a bonus, but if you actually take something away and claw back our pay, we get very upset about it. So if I were a company, I would look more to maybe other perks and ways to proceed without an actual pay cut, because people do notice that.
Absolutely. And you mentioned this Facebook announcement. We have a quick soundbite from Mark we want to air really quickly. So let's just take a quick listen to that.
Over the next 5 to 10 years, about 50% of our people could be working remotely. But we're going to do this in a way that is measured and thoughtful and responsible.
So I'm wondering if you can just talk through what impetus Facebook or other companies would have to keep people in these cities if they're moving to a permanent work from home model.
Yeah, so I think that it's really interesting to see this play out in the tech sector, because it does seem partly motivated there by a desire to get some of these salaries under control. I think I was reading that the median salary at Facebook is in the mid $200,000 a year range. So
Wow.
that's a median salary, right? So people who are working there are making a lot, and that's a huge cost for Facebook. So I think that there are, things people want to do maybe there to try to control those costs. And then there are also issues with office space. So I'm sure that they maybe have space issues that they would want to try to control those costs as well. So I think that, one of the funny things about Facebook saying outright that they're going to cut people's pay if they move away is that it might have this strange effect of keeping people coming into the office. It's like, oh, well, if you were going to cut my pay if I moved, then I guess I'll come in after all. So if they were hoping to use that, then they might have just undercut that a little bit.
Right. And you would imagine that it would discourage people from doing that if they were thinking about it. And I wonder if you can also talk through how the relationship between an employee and manager might change if we forever work from home. That's a question we got from our audience.
Yeah, so I think that this is really a fascinating time to be a manager, a challenging time, but also a time when there's so many new habits and practices that we can try. And I think the important thing to remember is that our old way of working wasn't ideal either. So even if you're running into problems with remote work, there were probably also managerial challenges you had when everyone was present. It's just that we have different challenges now. So like something that seems to be working very well is regular check-ins. So maybe you just touch base with employees over the phone at a scheduled time every week. And maybe it's not for very long. Maybe it's just for a few minutes. But that kind of replaces the casual walk-by conversation where you might have once just dropped by their desk. So there does need to be a little bit more intentionality, I think, in how bosses are communicating with employees. And the other thing that, is it sort of interesting in this moment too, is that I think that there's a sort of desire by managers to use video calls as much as possible. But it turns out that the boss employee relationship is inherently a relationship in which power is different, right? And so when we're on video with our boss, we might be thinking too much about how do I look right now, and what is my boss saying to me, and should I look into the camera or should I look down at their face, And so I think actually for these check-ins, a phone call is probably better than a video call, just because it'll make the employee relax a little bit more.
That's a great point. That's really interesting feedback. And I wonder, you've talked a bit about the end of water cooler discussions, right? What will a world of working from home look like, not just for the manager-employee relationship, but for peer-to-peer relationships as well?
Yeah, I think it'll be different, right? It's there are some tools like Slack where some people, maybe introverts, feel actually more comfortable being themselves in that kind of environment where they have time to plan out what they're going to say. And so there's still these informal conversations happening, but sometimes it's different people chiming in. So I think some people are going to love it. It's going to free them up to maybe be a little bit more, share a little bit more with their colleagues than they would have. Other people who are used to hanging out by the water cooler might find it a very challenging transition. So I think we need to be sensitive to that, especially when we're sort of negotiating new relationships with colleagues. And I think that this is another place where, video meetings tend to start right on time. You're not walking around looking for the room, right? So you can just sort of start as soon as you all sign in. And then people have a tendency to get right down to brass tacks from the outset, but maybe spend a couple minutes at the beginning just chit-chatting to replace the sort of lack of natural chit-chat ability that we have during the rest of the workday.
Right. I so appreciate your optimism through all this. It's such a great point that introverts might actually thrive in a work from home environment. That's a really lovely point.
Thanks. I mean, I'm a little bit introverted myself, so I do find sometimes it's easy. I am more comfortable on Slack or email than I am just sort of like roaming the office looking for excuses to talk to people. So hopefully
Right.
other people feel the same way.
I'm sure they do. And I want to ask you, going back a little bit to this discussion about Facebook and working from home, things like that. Do you think that offices will start to let go of their leases in these expensive places, particularly in New York City, where the rent is so astronomical?
Yeah, I think some companies, especially those who really need to aggressively cut costs, that certainly is one of the places that they will look. It can be very expensive to break a lease, but if your lease was expiring anyway, maybe you'll decide to move out of that expensive neighborhood, but that was so easy to commute to, like right downtown. Maybe you'll decide to take a smaller space to take up fewer floors in the building if people stop coming into the office as much. But I actually see this as a sort of positive development in some ways, because I think office space is expensive. It's a major cost for companies, and they may just find that it's cheaper to let people work from home for an indefinite period of time than it is to try to retrofit their office with, an air filtration system or some kind of new plexiglass barrier to protect people from getting the virus that way. So for a lot of companies, just sort of reducing their footprint is going to be a better option.
Absolutely. And more broadly, do you see employees? I know I can speak for the millennials of New York that rent is very expensive, and without needing to be there for our jobs, there's not a ton of reason to be there other than social life, which is also gone. So do you see people leaving these big expensive cities to kind of have a bit of normalcy right now?
That's a tough question to answer because anecdotally, yes, I have heard from many friends who, we live in the suburbs and we have many friends who live in the city who are suddenly very interested in what our life is like in the suburbs. Before they sort of dismissed us as being uncool, and now they're like, oh, maybe that's nice. Um, but I think that moving is a really big decision. And for a very long time, economists have wondered, why don't Americans move out of struggling cities into cities where there are more jobs? Americans just, especially Americans, don't seem to move around that much according to economic sort of nudges. The decision of where to live is highly personal. No matter what, at the end of this, New York is still going to be New York. So I think it is one of those things where right now there's a ton of headlines about this is, the death of cities and the rise of suburbs. And I just am a little bit cautious. I don't think the changes will be that extreme.
Absolutely. And that also leads to another question we have on commuting. Do you think that if people don't leave these big cities where commuting is a challenge, do you think commutes will change at all?
I would love to see them change because most of us really do not enjoy our commutes that much. I think what we might see as things get to a new normal is people going into the office every other week, or people going in some days of the week and not others. I think that, that would certainly have a net positive effect for many people's lives, having that flexibility. It would have a net positive effect on the environment if there's fewer of us traveling every day just to do in an office the exact same thing we can do at home. So I think there will be a change in commuting. I think one of my sort of fears is that virus worries will have more people wanting to commute by car and fewer people wanting to take public transportation. So that obviously will lead to huge crowding issues, parking issues, and environmental issues. So that's another reason why I think working from home, at least part of the time, is a great option.
Of course. And you mentioned this earlier as well, but we got a lot of questions from our audience about if they want to work from home permanently, should they expect a pay cut? And you've talked about how employees can actually be more valuable from home, but I'm wondering if you can give some advice for how employees might broach those conversations.
I would not be the one who brings up the pay cut. I would talk to your boss about permanent work from home or indefinite work from home or medium-term work from home arrangements, but I'd never be the one to raise the pay cut issue. Do not ask your boss, don't plant that seed in their mind. I think a lot of managers are receptive to suggestions that you approach as experiments. If you say, wow, this last couple months of working from home, I have just been so productive. I've gotten all this stuff done. Be specific, point to your accomplishments. say, I would love to be able to continue this for the next 3 months and see how that goes. I think a lot of managers would be receptive to that and responsive to that. And then maybe at the end of that period of time, you can say, could we do this? Keep trying this, maybe another 6 months. Let me know if you ever perceive a problem with my work. Happy to come in if you need me to come in, but this seems to be working well for everyone. If you are able to make that kind of case and point to results that show that you're being super productive, then I think a lot of managers would be happy to grant you that. But never be the one to say, oh, and I would take a pay cut, to be able to do that. Just don't ever offer to give money back to your company unless they bring it up first.
Very good advice there. And I also want to remind our audience, for those watching, please comment with any questions you have for Sarah, and we will get to as many as we can here. One topic we haven't touched on is working from home for parents. What is a working parent supposed to do right now? And what will they do if this becomes permanent?
This is a really tough time for working parents and for people who have caregiving responsibilities. I think especially with young children who are less self-sufficient and who may not understand exactly why you're staring at your laptop all day. This is really tough. It's especially tough for single parents. A lot of the work from home arrangements that are working for parents I know are ones where there's 2 parents in the household, and one parent sort of works a morning shift where they maybe they work from 5 in the morning until noon, but then their spouse works from noon until 7 p.m. and then they just trade off who takes care of the kids. If you are a single parent, though, that option is obviously not available to you. So I think that, again, one of the things this virus is forcing us to do is confront what services are truly necessary. And I think schools, childcare, these things are truly necessary. So I think that to the extent that we can reopen parts of society that need to be reopened, but keep those parts of society closed where in-person contact isn't necessary, I think that's a way to keep the curve fairly flat. It's not like a switch where we reopen everything, reopen school, come back to the office, go get a haircut, all at the same time. If a third of the US workforce can work from home, they should keep working from home. But we do need to find some kind of sustainable solution for parents because this is just not sustainable for them.
Right. And you also wrote in your piece about things like internet access, which is not equal for everyone. Can you talk about those problems a little bit?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges of this time has been that as we've individually encountered these challenges, whether it's internet access or, child responsibilities, we're all solving them as individuals. And what companies can help do is come up with solutions that work for a larger proportion of their staff. So for example, on the internet access issue, if my internet access is bad, there is very little that I can do as an individual to improve it. I can sign up for faster bandwidth, but I'm limited by where I live. So I think that something companies could do, for example, is switch to some systems that require less of that bandwidth. So video calls are very bandwidth heavy. And it may be that you need to have some video calls, but you can do the rest over the phone. And then it's less of an issue. So I think that there just needs to be some sensitivity to the fact that not everyone has the greatest internet connection. And what are the solutions that are a little bit lighter weight that companies and teams can use that don't put quite so much pressure on them.
Wonderful point. And we have one other question from our audience, a member who asked, instead of working from home, will companies consider staggering work hours or rotating days? You talked about this a bit, but do you know what systems companies are already talking about implementing?
Yes. So I think one of the solutions I've seen companies using is asking, basically breaking their workforce into kind of an A team or a B team or a red and blue team, and having one subset of workers come in for 2 weeks. Then they clean the office, they disinfect everything. Maybe they have a weekend in the middle to let any germs die natural deaths. And then the other team comes in for 2 weeks and they kind of alternate that way. That seems to be working reasonably well. I think it's better to do something like that than say, have people alternate days, because then, that's a lot of cleaning. And while a lot of companies have beefed up their cleaning, it seems like it's better to go maybe like 1 week and then another week, as opposed to having sort of every other day. And then in terms of hours, a lot of companies are also doing this for people who do need to come into the office. So you don't want everyone sort of pushing into the elevator at the same time at 8:30 in the morning. So maybe you ask some people to come in at 7:30 and some people not till 10, and you just kind of space it out that way throughout the day.
Absolutely. And we have to let you go here soon so that you can get back to your amazing work. But we did have one audience member comment that this is a once in a lifetime possibility for climate change to potentially be positively impacted by this moment where we're all working from home. But I know you also mentioned that people might be in their cars more. How do you see working from home impacting our environment?
I am so glad that you raised that question, because to me, yes, I 100% agree. If we can make this work from home work and come up with the management systems and processes we need to really support people as they make this transition, it could have a huge impact on the planet. And I think that one of the things that's going to be really challenging and fearful for people in the future is public transit in the immediate future. So I was very happy to be a train commuter. I felt so virtuous that I was taking the train instead of driving. But I don't really want to do that hour-long train ride now with a bunch of people who could potentially be sick. So I think that to the extent that companies can support people in work from home arrangements for the indefinite future, they could have a really important impact on the planet and on emissions. So I really hope that is a factor that companies are considering.
Absolutely. Sarah, we're so thankful for your time. Just as we're wrapping up here, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you think is important to add to this conversation? Anything that's been on your mind about working from home?
I would just say I understand that there are some jobs that are really tough to do at home, but what we know from Census Bureau data is that a third of us probably can do our jobs from home. And if we keep staying home, even if sometimes it feels a little weird, and even if we miss our colleagues, which I do, it will make the world a little less dense, if that makes sense, for the other people who have to move around and go in. So I think that if it's working for you, if it's working for your company, it's just something we should keep doing a little bit longer until we learn more about this virus and the direction it's going to take, and maybe beyond that too, for environmental reasons.
Absolutely. Well, Sarah, thank you so, so much for joining us. We're so thankful for your time. And thank you to our audience for watching. You can follow QuickTake on all platforms. We're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. So be sure to check us out. And thank you so, so much again.
Thank you. This was great.